5 years ago, I finished a project that I was genuinely deeply proud of. It was a small coffee table made of premium American walnut, the kind of wood that has a weight and a density you can feel the moment you pick up the rough slab. I spent 3 weeks of meticulous labor in my workshop on that piece. I remember the exact smell of the walnut dust filling the air and the high-pitched whine of my random orbital sander as I worked my way through the grits. I was disciplined. I didn't skip steps. I went from 80 to 120 to 180, 220, and finally I polished that tabletop all the way to 320 grit. At that level, the wood starts to lose its organic texture. It becomes cold and glassy under your fingertips, feeling more like a sheet of polished automotive plastic than something that once grew out of the earth. I was chasing a standard of perfection I'd seen in high-end magazines. Then came the finish. I used a high-quality Danish oil, applying 3 separate layers. I followed the instructions on the back of the tin like a religious text. 24 hours of drying time between each coat, light buffing in between. When I was done, the result looked like a benchmark for the craft. The tone was deep and even, and when the afternoon sun hit it from the side, it had this soft, silky luster that made the grain pop. I delivered it to the client and felt a rare sense of total peace. I was certain that table would look exactly like that for the next 50 years. 18 months later, my phone buzzed on my workbench. It was a message from the client with a single photograph attached. I looked at the screen, and for a second, I didn't even recognize my own work. The table was there, the joinery was still tight, but the surface looked like it had never been touched by a drop of oil in its life. The finish hadn't peeled off in flakes, and it hadn't cracked like a cheap hardware store varnish. It had simply evaporated. The walnut had become dry, matte, and utterly dead. In the high traffic areas, where books were slid across or where coffee mugs sat, the rich chocolate brown of the walnut had faded to the color of old, sun-bleached packing cardboard. I drove to the client's house, picked up the table, and brought it back to my shop. I spent a long time just sitting in front of it in the silence, trying to figure out where I had failed. The wood was structurally perfect. There was no warping, no checking, but the protection was gone. It was as if the wood had rejected the oil, or the oil had just decided to leave. That same month, by total coincidence, I found myself in the workshop of an old restorer in Yaroslavl. This was a man who spent his days working on pieces from 15th century manor collections, furniture that had survived revolutions, wars, and centuries of neglect. On his workbench sat a walnut panel that was over 250 years old. It had a deep, living glow that I can only describe as inner light. The color didn't look like a thin film sitting on top. It looked like it originated from deep within the fibers. I walked over, hesitant, and touched it. The tactile sensation was nothing like my 320 grit plastic finish. It was warm. It felt like wood, yet it was smoother than anything I'd ever produced. I asked him how the wood could possibly look like this after 2.5 centuries. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at my hands, calloused but dusty from my power sander, and then he looked at the stack of sandpaper sticking out of my tool bag. "The finish only stays where the surface is prepared to receive it," he said. He wasn't being condescending, he was stating a technical fact. "You're a sander. You spend your time grinding the wood into submission, and then you wonder why it doesn't want to hold on to the life you try to give it back." He spent the next 2 hours showing me what sandpaper actually does to wood fibers at a microscopic level. It was a revelation that turned my 20 years of experience on its head. I realized that what we in the modern world consider ideal preparation is actually a process of fundamental structural destruction. When you run an abrasive, whether it's aluminum oxide or silicon carbide, across a board, those tiny grains aren't cutting the wood. They are tearing it. Under an electron microscope, a surface sanded to 220 grit doesn't look smooth. It looks like a battlefield. The abrasive grains rip, crush, and fold the ends of the wood fibers back into the surface. Researchers at the Forestry University in Helsinki have a specific term for this, the destroyed layer. This is a zone, usually between 30 and 80 microns thick, where the natural capillaries of the wood, the very pipes that are supposed to suck up your oil or varnish, are completely smashed and blocked. They are filled with a mixture of crushed cell walls and microscopic dust that is forced deep into the pores by the pressure and vibration of the sanding pad. I eventually ran my own tests to confirm what the master told me. I found that on a piece of white oak, the penetration depth of linseed oil is reduced by 35% if the surface is sanded versus if it's planed with a sharp blade. On walnut, that figure jumps to 45%. When I sanded that table 5 years ago, I wasn't opening the wood up, I was building a hermetic plug. The oil couldn't get into the cellular structure, it was just sitting on a loose, unstable cushion of mangled fibers. Over the first few months, you can't tell the difference, but the destroyed layer is a lie. As soon as the wood starts to breathe with changes in humidity, those crushed fibers try to straighten back out. As they move, they literally push the finish out, molecule by molecule, until your protection is gone and the wood is left naked. That is exactly why my table died. Today, I'm going to show you how to stop killing your wood. I'm going to walk you through a method of surface preparation that was the global standard for centuries, before sandpaper became a cheap industrial crutch. We are going to look at why a hand plane and a scraper don't just make the wood smooth, but how they actually prime the cellular structure to accept a finish that will last longer than you will. And at the very end, I'll share a specific technique, a little trick involving a piece of bone that completely changes the optics of the wood, creating a depth that no amount of 1000 grit sandpaper can ever hope to achieve. Standing in that restoration workshop in Yaroslavl, I was surrounded by a scent that you just can't replicate in a modern cabinet shop. It's a heavy, comforting mixture of boiled linseed oil, animal hide glue, and the sharp, spicy note of dry wood that's been seasoned for over a century. This wasn't a place for quick turnarounds. It was a sanctuary for materials that had survived things our modern furniture never could. On the benches were parts of massive oak cabinets and walnut chairs from the late 1400s, pieces built when the very idea of sandpaper didn't exist in the craftsman's vocabulary. We often forget how young our modern methods really are. The first mass-produced abrasive papers didn't hit the market until the middle of the 19th century. Before that, every master joiner, every cabinet maker, and every wheelwright solved the problem of surface smoothness with one thing: hardened steel. And this wasn't about a lack of technology, it was a deliberate engineering choice born out of necessity. The masters of the past worked in what we would today consider extreme environments. These pieces lived in Russian manor houses or European estates with massive masonry stoves. In the summer, the wood would swell in the humid, swampy air. In the winter, the heat from the stoves would dry the air out until the wood rang like a bell. Under those conditions, a finish that simply sits on the surface, like our modern film building lacquers, would peel and flake away within 2 or 3 seasons. To make furniture that would serve generations, the finish couldn't just be a layer. It had to become part of the wood's cellular structure. It had to penetrate deep, sealing the fibers from the inside out. The restorer showed me a tattered German apprentice manual from the mid-1800s. I flipped through the pages, looking for the chapter on finishing. There wasn't a single word about sanding or gritting up. The education of a master didn't start with assembly, it started with sharpening. An apprentice spent 7 years in the shop, not because he was slow, but because his hands had to learn the difference of 0.5 millimeter in the set of a planes iron. The central philosophy of the old school was simple. The surface must be cut, not rubbed. It was a sophisticated understanding of wood, not as a solid block, but as a complex system of hollow capillaries, thousands of tiny tubes designed to transport moisture. When you work with a razor-sharp hand plane, you aren't just smoothing the board, you're acting like a surgeon with a scalpel. The edge of the iron shears through the cell walls cleanly, leaving their mouths wide open. This allows the oil, wax, or varnish to flow into those tubes by capillary action, often reaching a depth of 2 to 3 millimeters. The tragedy of the modern workshop is that we've become hostages to speed. The industry sold us sandpaper as a shortcut, but they never mentioned the hidden cost. For years, I believed that the progression from 80 grit to 320 grit was the hallmark of quality. In reality, I was just building a more efficient plug of dust and crushed fibers. We've learned to rely on powerful modern chemicals, polyurethanes and acrylics, that create a thick plastic shell. This film stays on the wood because of its own internal strength, not because it's actually bonded to the material. It masks the problem of poor surface preparation perfectly, right up until the moment a microcrack develops. Then moisture gets underneath, and the finish begins to lift in sheets, because beneath that plastic is the destroyed layer the master spoke about. I remember the restorer taking a simple steel scraper, making 2 light passes across a piece of 100-year-old oak, and handing me the shaving. It was translucent, like onion skin, and it smelled like a fresh-cut tree. He said, "Look closely. The wood under this skin is alive. It's thirsty. It's ready to take the oil and hold it forever. Your sandpaper just beats the dirt deeper into the grain." That was the moment I realized that my pursuit of smoothness was actually making my wood look like plastic while stripping away its ability to defend itself against time. Returning to hand tools isn't about nostalgia, it's about engineering. Tradition isn't the worship of ashes, it's the preservation of the fire. And in our case, that fire is the technical knowledge of how the physics of the material dictates the rules of the craft. Now, let's move from the history books to the workbench. If you're like I was 4 years ago, someone who has spent a lifetime relying on the hum of a random orbital sander, transitioning to manual tools might feel like taking a step into the unknown. But it's the only way to stop violating the material and start collaborating with it. In my practice, I've distilled this transition into 3 fundamental stages of preparation that completely replace the hours of dusty, soul-crushing sanding. The first and most critical stage is the use of the smoothing plane. For final surface preparation, I rely on a number 4 smoothing plane. This is a classic tool, but the way it comes out of the box from a modern factory is almost never ready for the level of work we're talking about. The heart of the tool is the iron, the blade. I take my iron to the waterstones and hone it until I reach 6,000 grit. I maintain a primary bevel of 25 degrees, and at the very tip, I hone a micro bevel at 30 degrees. This micro bevel is what gives the edge the necessary shoulders to resist folding when it strikes the hard, silica-rich late wood of an annual ring. But there is one nuance that most modern woodworkers miss: the camber. This is a nearly invisible curve across the cutting edge, about 0.5 millimeters of relief from the center to the corners. Without this camber, the sharp corners of your plane iron will leave tracks or tiny steps in the wood that you'll be tempted to sand out. When I first tuned my plane this way and took a pass across a piece of black walnut, I actually stopped moving. A shaving came out of the mouth of the plane that was thinner and more translucent than a piece of cigarette paper. The surface left behind didn't just look smooth, it shone with a natural luster, as if it had already been varnished. This is the clean cut. Mechanically, the sharp blade is shearing the fibers at an aggressive angle, never allowing the cell walls to collapse. If modern abrasives work on the principle of friction and tearing, the hand plane works on the principle of the scalpel. I set the depth of the cut to the absolute minimum, just enough to catch the wood. If the shaving is thick or the tool chatters, the iron is either dull or extended too far. On difficult woods like figured walnut or bird's eye maple, where the grain direction flips every half inch, I use a trick I learned from those old manuals: increasing the angle of attack. A standard plane bed is 45 degrees. On these wild grains, I switch to a plane bedded at 50 or 55 degrees, or I hone a small back bevel on the flat side of the iron. This higher angle forces the wood fiber to break and curl immediately upon being cut, preventing the blade from diving under the grain and lifting a chunk out, what we call tear out. The second stage is the work with the cabinet scraper, or what the old masters called the chiclea. When the plane has done the heavy lifting, there may still be microscopic ripples or transitions between passes. A scraper is not just a piece of flat steel, it is an instrument of surgical precision. I use a plate about 0.8 millimeters thick. The secret of the scraper isn't the edge itself, but the burr. Most beginners think a scraper is supposed to scratch the wood, but that's wrong. A properly prepared scraper cuts. I start by filing the edge of the steel perfectly square at 90 degrees. Then I hone that edge on my stones until it mirrors my smoothing plane iron. Then comes the magic. I take a hardened steel burnishing rod and, with significant pressure, I draw it across the edge at an angle of about 10 to 15 degrees. This creates a tiny hooked burr, a microscopic plow on the edge of the steel. When you hold the scraper, flexing it slightly with your thumbs to create a curve, and push it across the wood, it should produce tiny, curly shavings. If you see dust, your burr didn't take, or it's already worn out. I remember my first time using a properly hooked scraper on a tabletop. In 10 minutes, the wood felt warmer and deeper than it ever did after an hour of 400 grit sanding. This is because the scraper removes the micro irregularities of the plane while keeping every single pore of the wood wide open. It doesn't smear anything, it only removes. The third stage is the moment of truth, the verification, and the oiling. To see what the hand cannot feel, I use a technique called raking light. I take a powerful LED work light and place it almost parallel to the surface of the wood. In this low-angle light, every microscopic fiber that hasn't been cut cleanly, every tiny ridge, casts a shadow like a mountain range. If the wood looks perfectly clean under raking light, I know it's ready for the finish. I decided to prove the difference with a controlled experiment in my shop. I took a single board of black walnut and divided it down the center. I sanded the left side through the grits all the way to 320, the way I used to. The right side I prepared only with a plane and a scraper. Then I applied pure tung oil to both sides simultaneously. The difference didn't take a year to show up, it took 5 seconds. On the sanded side, the oil sat in a stagnant pool. It struggled to penetrate that destroyed layer of dust and crushed cells. I had to keep rubbing it in, trying to force it past the blockage. On the planed side, the oil vanished instantly. The wood literally drank the finish. Within half an hour, when I wiped away the excess, the difference in chatoyancy, that shimmering three-dimensional look of the grain, was staggering. The planed side had an optical depth, a glow that seemed to come from 2 millimeters inside the board. The sanded side looked flat, muddy, and dull in comparison. The next day, I tested the surface hardness with a metal stylus. On the sanded side, the stylus left a clear, deep groove because the oil had only cured as a thin, brittle film on the surface. On the planed side, the stylus barely made a mark. The oil had integrated into the cell walls, reinforcing the wood from within. We spend weeks building our projects, but we try to save a few hours at the end by reaching for the sander. That is our greatest mistake. We aren't saving time, we are robbing our work of its future. Over the years, I've realized that our mistakes in the workshop aren't just about what our hands are doing. They're about how our minds are wired. Our thinking is often cluttered with industrial templates that prevent us from seeing obvious technical flaws. The first and most persistent pattern is the belief that sandpaper is a mandatory final step. We've been conditioned to think that the sequence, sand to 220, then finish, is the only path to a professional result. But truth be told, sandpaper was never designed to increase quality. It was designed for standardization and speed in mass production settings where one master had to oversee 100 low-skilled laborers. We've mistaken an industrial crutch for a gold standard of craftsmanship. When you realize that the sandpaper is actually the enemy of your finish's longevity, your entire approach to the material shifts. The second mistake is the blind faith in high-grit numbers. I've seen guys go up to 600, 800, or even 1,000 grit on raw wood, thinking they're achieving perfection. In reality, the finer the abrasive, the more effectively it seals the destroyed layer with a microscopic slurry of dust and crushed cells. By the time you hit 500 grit, you've essentially built a waterproof shield out of the wood itself. Your oil doesn't penetrate, it just oxidizes into a thin, fragile crust on the surface. That polished look you see under the shop lights is an illusion of quality. a temporary mask that will fail at the first significant change in humidity. Third is the ritual of raising the grain. We've all done it, wiping the wood with a damp cloth, waiting for the fibers to stand up, and then sanding them back down. We treat this like a sacred technological necessity. But when you look at it through the lens of a hand-planed surface, you realize that raising the grain is just an attempt to fix a wound we inflicted ourselves. The grain only pops up because the sandpaper mangled and folded the fibers instead of cutting them. On a surface prepared with a razor-sharp smoothing plane, there is nothing to raise. The cells are sliced clean and their walls remain stationary. I haven't raised the grain on a project in 4 years, and my finishes have never been more stable. The fourth pattern is the touch-only metric. We trust our fingertips too much. A surface can feel as smooth as a mirror, but be completely dead from an adhesion standpoint. A master doesn't just feel for smoothness, he looks for the clarity of the structure. The difference between a sanded board and a planed board is the difference between frosted glass and clear crystal. One scatters the light, the other invites it in. If you want that museum-quality depth, you have to stop trying to make wood feel like plastic. Finally, there's the fear of the tool itself. We've been told that mastering a hand plane or a cabinet scraper takes a lifetime of dedicated study. That is a myth, one that's very profitable for the companies selling you $500 sanding stations. In my experience, a woodworker with basic hand-eye coordination needs exactly 2 weeks of practice to learn how to sharpen and set a plane for a finish cut. It's an investment of time that pays for itself in the very first project where you don't have to spend 6 hours vibrating your hands numb with a power tool. Now, for that bonus technique the Yaroslavl master showed me, something I've never seen in a modern woodworking textbook. He called it compacting the bone. After you've finished with the scraper, but before you apply a drop of oil, you need to treat the surface with something harder than the wood, but without a cutting edge. He used a piece of polished cattle bone. I use a burnished block of ultra-dense boxwood or a polished stainless steel rod. You take the burnisher and, with firm, even pressure, you rub it along the grain. You aren't removing material, you are performing a localized compression of the cell walls at the very surface. This increases the light reflection coefficient of the wood without clogging the pores with dust. When you do this, the wood takes on a natural, deep gloss that doesn't fade over decades. It's a mechanical change, not a chemical one. When the oil finally hits that compacted surface, it flows into the open capillaries, but the surface itself remains dense and highly resistant to scratches and water rings. I use this now on every highware surface, armrests, tabletops, and tool handles. It provides that inner glow that no chemical finish can replicate. I eventually took that walnut coffee table back to the shop, stripped off the evaporated finish, and started over. No sandpaper touched it this time. I used my number 4 plane, followed by a cabinet scraper, and then I spent an hour burnishing the top with a polished steel plate. I finished it with nothing but pure linseed oil and a bit of beeswax. That was 4 years ago. That table has lived through 2 kids, countless coffee mugs, and the dry heat of 4 winters. It hasn't faded. In fact, it's actually gotten better. It's developed a patina and a depth that only comes when the wood and the finish are truly one. Old masters weren't wizards. They just understood that steel and wood speak the same language, while abrasives are just a scream that drowns out the material. The next time you reach for a pack of sandpaper, just stop for a second and think about those open pores and those cleanly sliced fibers. It might just be the start of your own path toward quality that actually lasts. Put the sander down, pick up the blade. Your wood will thank you for it in 100 years.